So yeah, the first panel is on Venezuela, which is one of the most, let's say, hot topics in political debates in the last decade, in the last couple of decades. Because I remember in the 2000s, Venezuela was the next big thing of the left. So the idea was, look, you thought socialism was dead, but here is Venezuela, here's Hugo Chavez, here's a country that is making use of its natural, let's say, resources and of its wealth, mostly oil, to bring prosperity to its people. And we had a lot of intellectuals in the West, leftist intellectuals, embracing Venezuela, traveling there, talking about this brilliant new experiment. Well, how did this end up? It's like this meme, how it started, how it's going. Well, how it's going is that it's not going well at all. And as usual, regimes that do not pay respect to individual rights have horrendous economic results, and vice versa. Regimes that don't respect individual economic rights have bad economic results. So with us today to discuss this, we've got Federico Fernández. So Federico is president of Fundación Internacional Bases in Argentina and also a senior fellow with the Austrian Economics Center. He is also the president of the organizing committee of the international conference, the Austrian School of Economics in the 21st century. So he's been very active and vocal in the freedom movement with papers, interventions, conferences. So Federico, many thanks for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Nikos. Can you hear me properly?
I can hear you properly, yes.
Great. Thank you very much for your kind introduction. Well, you basically said that the most important things that people should take away from this talk. Socialism doesn't work, even in an oil-rich country like Venezuela. But because we have some time to fill, I'll try to add a few sentences to your important message. But that was really the most important thing people can find out about this. Firstly, let me thank you and Mirela especially for putting this program together. It's fantastic that we're going to be the whole day discussing about the topic of human rights, as both of you mentioned in the introductory words. These are not, let's say, abstract ideas. These are things that have a profound impact in our lives. And it's very important that the people who are, let's say, in the more classical liberal side, in the objectivistic side, we have a say about these important issues. So thanks to the Ayn Rand Center Romania, thanks to Ayn Rand Europe for putting this in collaboration with the Free Market Roadshow. We're very happy to be part of this. I'm going to talk about Venezuela. I'll be talking for the next 20 minutes or so. I'll try to be quick, but unfortunately there's a lot to be said about this issue and not many good things. Anyway, we started a little bit earlier, so I have a couple of extra minutes. Before describing and giving you a few ideas about what's going on precisely with human rights in Venezuela, I would like you to take a quick detour and talk about what kind of country Venezuela was, what kind of system was established in Venezuela 20 years ago or so, because I don't want to commit the crime that was recently denounced by a great economist, Dan Mitchell, who talked about something written on the New York Times in which they talk about all the violations of human rights in Venezuela without mentioning socialism. And that's very important, to understand what's going on in the country. So, to begin, Hugo Chavez arrived to power in 1999 to Venezuela. He got into office. He would remain in power until 2013, year of his death. It's not that he lost any elections or, he was kicked out as he should have been. He just died. By the way, he died in Cuba, probably thanks to the medical system of Cuba. So thanks to that, Cuba, that was, let's say, some sort of contribution to human liberty. Anyway, in 1999, Chavez started what he called 21st century socialism. It's very interesting that in Latin America, we are great forward thinkers. We were in 1999, the 20th century was not even over, and we were already thinking of 21st century socialism. In 2013, Chavez passed away, and he was succeeded in power by Nicolás Maduro. Nicolás Maduro was his personal driver, and he's a professional bus driver. Now he's, driving the destiny of a nation. These two are the main figures. Of course, they are, let's say, surrounded by certain lackeys that are doing a lot. But these are the two main figures of the populist socialist government in Venezuela in the last 20 years or so. What kind of country was Venezuela before Chavez and Maduro arrived? Well, Venezuela, and these points will be extremely ironic when you see it from today's perspective. Venezuela used to be the most stable democracy in Latin America. Elections were fair and transparent. Public officials respected their mandated terms, and they left office. And because of this, in part, it was considered a safe haven for the rest of the region. When we had trouble, particularly in the 70s, in which Brazil, Argentina, Chile, and many other countries had military dictatorships, many people exiled to Venezuela because it was this stable democracy in which human rights were respected. It was a relatively wealthy country. It was, compared to the rest of the region by GDP per capita, it was way wealthier. It was almost a developed country by the 60s and 70s. And, well, this was in close relationship that Venezuela was considered the so-called key to Latin America, not only because of its geographic position, which is like in the north of South America, so it's very close to Mexico and the US, but also close to Colombia, Brazil, but also because of its economic importance. It was the base for most of, for instance, multinational companies that wanted to operate in Latin America. Venezuela, by the way, and I think this is a very important topic, Venezuela has the biggest concentration per capita of beauty queens in the world. Google this and you'll thank me later. Yeah, it's the home of the beauty, definitely. Unfortunately, it was the home of the beast as well, and the two beasts, particularly Chavez and Maduro. And these beasts were very, very, very lucky. And let me tell you why. When Chavez in 1999 got into office, was elected president, the barrel of oil was less than $10. Venezuela, you all probably know, but just in case, Venezuela literally floats on oil. The biggest proven reserves of oil in the world are in Venezuela, more than Saudi Arabia, more than Qatar, the Emirates, etc. Venezuela floats on oil, has this huge oil. Chavez gets into power, the barrel, not even $10. Well, from then on, it only went up. By 2008, the price had skyrocketed up to $140, which I think is a world record price. It's true, 2008, it sharply declined because of the crisis, but it recovered very quickly and it got into 120. Price, average price more or less, that it remained for 4 years in a row. 4 years. Now, with the supposed low prices, oil is, yesterday I checked, it closed at $43 per barrel. That's 4.5 times more or less the price of Chavez taking office. It's obvious that what's going on in Venezuela has nothing to do with the oil price. I mean, let's say the humanitarian crisis due to the economic catastrophe. In fact, this should have been a golden age for Venezuela. I always like to put this example, things that, Nikos, things you or your family that I tell you, in the next 20 years, your income will be, at the end of the 20 years, it will be almost 5 times what it is today, but not only that, at one point it will be 14 times what it is today. For 4 years in a row, it will be 12 times what it is today. I don't think your response will be, then I will be absolutely bankrupt by the end of this process. No, this is like the best thing that can happen to you. And this is what Chavez and Maduro got for several years. And this is basically what boosted the populist and socialist government that Chavez and Maduro, now continuing, are imposing into Venezuela, with the horrible results that we'll see. Socialist redistribution operates basically as drug addiction. And I'm not thinking, and allow me to be a little bit harsh here, I'm not thinking of any soft drugs, I'm not thinking of marijuana or anything like that, I'm thinking of heroin. Socialist redistribution is like heroin. At the beginning, probably is great, at the very beginning. In time, it totally destroys you and probably kills you. And that is what we are seeing in Venezuela. The problem with these populist and socialist governments is that when, let's say, the system that they apply is going to kill itself eventually, as if you would do if you were consuming heroin. The problem is that when the failures, the cracks become apparent, they don't say, hey, sorry, we messed up, let's call someone who does it better, let's liberalize the economy. No, they denounce some sort of conspiracy. There's always, a conspiracy by dark forces, the international banks, global capitalism, I don't know, the Ayn Rand Center, whatever, Europe or Romania, whatever, or both probably, conspiring against Venezuela. And this is the way they do things. Of course, this narrative is completely false. And as I was mentioning, this was just a crazy bonanza, a crazy public waste of money, boosted by insane international oil prices, that eventually was going to collapse, like any of these programs do. I always like to bring to the attention, when I'm talking about these things, a term coined by Ludwig von Mises. Von Mises was an Austrian economist, a member of the Austrian School of Economics, one of the brightest, definitely. And he always talked about socialism in close relationship to a term he coined that was destructionism. Socialism is basically that, is destruction. According to Mises, socialism doesn't create anything, doesn't produce anything. The only thing that socialism can do is to leave out the stocks and what was produced by previous generations in a more free market environment. And this is exactly what happened in Venezuela, with, let's say, with an addition. Chavez not only had the stocks of Venezuela under a more capitalist regime, but also had the insane, the windfall coming from the insane international oil prices. And well, this brought a party, at least for some time. But and now going to the to the human rights situation in Venezuela. As I mentioned, when the problems appear, of course the system reacts, and reacts in the worst way, because it's not a reaction saying, okay, in which things we failed. No, it's who we are going to blame. And let's say the response can be divided into two parts. The first part is like a more political response. The second is like a more direct response. I'll start with the political one. Bobbio and Matteucci, who are two political philosophers from Italy, they define populism as a syndrome. Populism is some sort of disease. It's something that attacks democracy and the republican institutions from within and undermines them. And according to them, and this is to me key to understand what's going on in Venezuela, according to them, populism is not necessarily totalitarian, but it can very well become totalitarian. And this is what we are seeing in Venezuela today. When, let's say, at the peak of the windfall of oil money, Chavez didn't have the necessity to be an absolute tyrant. He was just an autocrat, let's say. Now, Maduro, when things are bad, he has to become a totalitarian leader. And this is what Venezuela is today. It's very funny that recently Felipe González, who was prime minister of Spain in in the 80s and early 90s. I think he was, by the way, a member of the Workers' Socialist Party of Venezuela, of Spain. He's not a, let's say, he's not a right-winger. He said that Venezuela is not a dictatorship. Venezuela is a tyranny. Why? Because a dictatorship was something like they had with Franco, where at least you had some rules. In Venezuela is whatever Maduro thinks and wants to do every day. It's absolute tyrannical. And I think that's a very good definition. In any case, the political part of the reaction of populism against its own failures brings about what Ralph Dahrendorf called the total citizen. What you need is this constant mobilization of the population, a smaller and a smaller part of the population that supports the regime. And you have these massive demonstrations, you have the protests against, I don't know, the American embassy or whatever you want to protest, you know, against the conspirators. It's very funny, by the way, that populism, very funny and sad, that populism ends up denying the political subject that they are supposed to bring to the center of the scene, which is the people. Because the only one who cares, and when you see, just Google some picture of a demonstration of Hugo Chavez in Venezuela, and the only one who can be identified is Hugo Chavez. The rest is a massive, you know, it's a massive amount of people all dressed the same, all dressed in red, completely, you know, total loss of your own individuality. It's just a big nothing, because the leader, the populist leader, incarnates and ends up denying the people. It's something like the tribal leader or the witch doctor. That's how populist leaders, what populist leaders become. But of course, with this militantism, massive mobilizations, etc., is not enough. So you need a more direct response. And what's the direct response? Well, the direct response came basically from two sources, let's say. The first one is very obvious, the totalitarian know-how that Cuba is providing Venezuela. Cuba is extremely active today in Venezuela, the Cuban regime, I mean not the people, poor people, they are as repressed as the Venezuelans, but the Cuban regime, the Cuban government is very much, it's a parasite that has taken over of the host, and it basically controls it. There are, by the way, in nature, certain cases of some parasites that end up controlling their hosts, and this is exactly the case of Cuba and Venezuela. The Cubans are running the repressive show, and the other source, I'll just mention it because, you know, maybe we can go further in the Q&A, is, let's say, a more the typical intellectual sources of Latin American populism, which are two authors. The first one is Carl Schmitt. He was a Nazi legal theorist. I think I don't have to add anything else. And the second one was Ernesto Laclau. He was an Argentinian philosopher. He lived all his life in the United Kingdom, which is very funny, by the way, because if you're a populist living in England, you know, which according to them is like the most imperialistic country ever, you know, it's a little bit of a contradiction. And in any case, you know, Laclau brought this idea of Schmitt, of this friend-enemy logic. And Laclau said something that is very telling and horrible. According to Laclau, the people is never the same as the total population in any given country. The people is always smaller than that. And the rest are the conspirators, the oligarchy, the bad ones, etc., etc. But I mean, behind all this, if you read Laclau, it's impossible to understand. It's all this postmodern jargon, obscure, opaque, but it's basically this tension that, I mean, has been postulated for centuries now between the people and the oligarchy. What I'm going to describe now, and with this I will be finishing, is what happens when you are the enemy. When you are not the people, these people that is smaller than the whole of the population, what happens to you? Well, and these are not my words, there are several reports already circulating, all done independently, and all basically with the same conclusions. These reports have been produced, among others, and I mentioned certain that are relatively new and by institutions that I suppose have done a good job. The Kasla Institute, it's an institute based in the Czech Republic, created, to follow the example of Václav Havel, the great first president of Czechoslovakia, and it's very much interested in Latin America. The Organization of American States, which is some sort of UN for the American continent, also produced a devastating report on the situation of human rights in Venezuela. And the United Nations, by the way, under the leadership of their High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is Michelle Bachelet. Michelle Bachelet was president twice of Chile. She's a member of the left there. I mean, she cannot be accused of being a neoconservative or anything like that. And her report also is appalling regarding Venezuela. All of them basically conclude in the following. Venezuela has become an open-air concentration camp. That's basically out of the question. I don't like reading, when I'm talking, but just I want to read a few lines of the Bachelet report. For at least a decade, the government, as well as the institutions controlled by the government, have applied dictates and policies that have accelerated the erosion of the rule of law and the dismantling of democratic institutions, including the National Assembly. The National Assembly, by the way, is the parliament. I mean, like Hitler or Fujimori, they destroyed the parliament. These measures are aimed at neutralizing, repressing, and criminalizing political opponents and critics of the government. This trend has increased since 2016. When you start feeling the burn, as Bernie Sanders would say, after the opposition won the majority of seats in the National Assembly, which led to an increase in the selective repression of the political opposition and an incessant restriction of the already limited democratic space. And end quote. The report also mentions something very interesting. In Venezuela, Maduro created in 2017 a group, a somewhat military police called the Fuerzas de Acciones Especiales, Special Action Forces, FAES in Spanish for the acronym. Well, they were created in 2017 supposedly to fight organized crime and terrorism. Well, they became terrorists themselves, and the worst kind of terrorist, which is not private terrorism, but state-sponsored terrorism. This is worse than any of the gangs, of terrorists that we know, because this is terrorism done by the state and for the state. They have killed just in 2008 and 2018 and beginning of 2019, 7,000 people under the supposed crime of resistance to authority. 7,000 people have been killed for resisting authority in Venezuela. And I've been talking for 22 minutes. I want to finish. Just let me mention a few things that a recent report by the UN mentions that, they consider these are crimes against humanity happening in Venezuela, and they are typified by the Rome Statute, which gave birth to the International Criminal Court. And this is very important, and just this thing, and I'll finish. Murders, imprisonment of dissidents, torture, sexual violence, forced disappearance, which was, by the way, what the military dictatorships in the 70s did in Argentina, Brazil, Chile, etc. So, what can we do? Three calls of action very quickly. First, we can support all the civil society's institutions that still remain in Venezuela, and I'll just mention one, but there are several. CEDICE in Venezuela, one of the eldest think tanks in the country, doing a heroic job trying to stop, this madness. Second, you can hire remotely professional people from Venezuela. There are platforms, for instance, like iWorker.io that allows you to do that, and you help them, and they help you boost your company or your business. That is something we also should keep in mind. And third, as I mentioned the International Criminal Court. Why? 6 countries in 2018 submitted an official request to the International Criminal Court, by the way, to Fatou Bensouda, who is the head prosecutor, to have Maduro and his lackeys trialed because of their human rights violation. And if you go to stopmaduro.com, it's a bilingual site in English and in Spanish, you can sign there to let the International Criminal Court that we want Maduro and all these criminal gangsters be brought to justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Federico. So I will play a bit devil's advocate here. So I will wear the hat of my former Marxist self. So I will ask two questions. That was the usual thing to all these accusations about Venezuela. The one thing was, but wait a minute, hasn't Chavez and Maduro actually done all the elections? And not only that, they must have been fair elections, because President Carter, for example, who was observing one of these elections, was there. And number two, and the most important thing, didn't Chavez actually lose the most important of them, which was the 2007 constitutional referendum? So this was the constitution that would transform, let's say, Venezuela to a more socialist, let's say, political system, officially transform it. And he lost it with a very tiny percentage. So would the opposition, to your view, say, this looks like a democracy, referendums, elections, referendums, like, where have we seen before a dictatorship where the regime is losing the elections?
No, that's it. Well, thank you, Nikos, and thanks to your former Marxist self for the question. Well, no, that's a very important question that you ask, because I mean there are many things that I could say about that and could be said about that, but just to be brief. Firstly, what we have to bear in mind is the problem with populism is that they reach, they get into power via elections, but they never want to, leave office. And so they start, let's say, undermining and tricking the system in order to never leave office. You mentioned the referendum. That was very interesting. There was another referendum because Chavez said, I'm very democratic. I'm so democratic that I'm going to put a clause in the Constitution that if enough, I don't remember which was the number exactly, but it was like, I don't know, like 400,000 people. If 400,000 people sign a petition to remove me from power, I will call a referendum to see, if I have to stay or leave. That happened once in Venezuela, and Chavez ended up winning the referendum, God knows how. But in any case, the important thing is that after the referendum, he got the list of the 400,000, let's say, who signed to remove him, and he basically purged them out of society. So you can't have a functioning democracy where, if you oppose the government, the retaliation would be that you would become civil, a civil death. And finally, one other thing. In Venezuela, I'm sure that Chavez in 1999 won the elections. He probably won a couple. But after you see what's the procedure, in 2016, they lost and they closed the National Assembly. They closed the parliament. They created a second parliament unelected. Then they have starting these false elections that nobody really, maybe Jimmy Carter, but well, that's not much of a seal of approval. But nobody believes that and by the way, in December, supposedly, there will be another election in Venezuela to elect the assembly again, and it's going to be an absolute charade.
And here's another thing, which is sometimes it's this dichotomy between democracy and rights. So quite often I hear the argument, and up to a point, it makes some sense. So this argument says, take some strongmen like Erdogan or Putin. So people who really know their stuff in terms of politics, they say, you know what? Today, if you had fair elections, no terrorizing, there's a very good chance that Erdogan and Putin would win again. And I don't know about Maduro, because from the outsider's perspective, the big difference is that Chavez at least had a charisma as an autocrat or as a populist. Maduro hasn't even got that. So do you think that there is, specifically after the last election, do you think that there is this critical mass that's gonna kick Maduro off? And the second question is, who's coming next? So is this guy who has been portrayed as this CIA operative, like, is this guy someone that people who are interested about individual rights and freedom, could we consider him a good option for Venezuela?
Well, to start with the first one, I think in Venezuela nowadays it's clear that they would lose a fair and transparent election. They would lose it. They have been losing. That's why they are either ignoring the results, creating, closing the parliament and things like that, or having elections that are a mock. It's true, and that's a major issue about democracy, and it's something that we have to be always careful. That is why, the problem is that Erdogan, Putin, or Juan Domingo Perón in Argentina and many others, what they want is basically countries that are literally democratic, in the sense that whoever wins can do whatever the hell they want. And well, that's not a kind of society I would like to live. I don't want to elect a dictator with absolute power every 4 years to do what he or she wants to achieve. So that is something we also should bear in mind, that yes, it's true, these people can win elections. They use the whole state apparatus in order to win elections. That's why they are demagogues. That's why they give you a subsidy for anything. That's why they create these giant programs. I mean, in Venezuela, everybody is poor now, but at one point, everybody got a subsidy, and they created a lot of clients, not voters. And and just to wrap up, regarding the second part, the political class of Venezuela is appalling. And that is extremely sad. Just to give you an idea to understand the level of stupidity of most of these people, there are some exceptions, of course. The main opposition party, which Leopoldo Lopez, who was in jail for a long time, now he's living in asylum at the Spanish embassy, or Guaidó, the supposed president. They belong to a party that is part of the Socialist Internationalist. I mean, this is absolutely insane. There are some exceptions. The problem is most of them, at least now, in the opposition, and there are exceptions like Maria Corina Machado, she's great, but the rest seem to want to do Chavismo without Chavez, and that would be a fatal mistake.
So there's one more question. We have something like 20 seconds, but I have to ask it. So the Nobel Prize winning economist Joseph Stiglitz has endorsed an ambitious plan by Chavez. Have we heard from Stiglitz lately about Venezuela?
And I think he has not pronounced himself anymore about Venezuela, but that tells you this has to do with what I said at the beginning. Chavez was welcomed by intellectuals, the international left, members of media. This is what they got now.
Right. So thank you very much, Federico. I'm highlighting what you said about solidarity with the real term, not how the Chavistas use the term. Real solidarity, which is try to actually do business with people who are struggling, help Venezuelans whatever way you want and you can. I like what you mentioned about these websites. iWork, it's called, where you can
iWorker.io.
Right. Excellent. So this was our first panel. Thank you very much, Federico.